Hello everybody and welcome to the
Sons of Aries podcast.
Beautiful. I'm Matthew Brown.
I'm Jason Cox.
And I'm Dan Zabiri. Good luck spelling that. So today we thought we'd dive into something that we've all been seeing a lot more, particularly you and I on YouTube. We do enjoy watching these when we're dicking about between doing jobs. And that is the more over kind of backlash against what we're calling wokeism, that obviously we don't need to explain. Every bugger in the world's seen it. And I think Matt, as someone who's the most clued into this kind of thing, having been much more recently through the university system, what do you think has really kind of facilitated this backlash?
Well, firstly, I think we should define it a little bit, because the terms, like historically, it meant sort of in the civil rights era, it was an awareness to actual systems of oppression that did exist, were there, and were implicit, and it was a stay woke man because there's shit there out to get you. It then morphed into not only an awareness of actual overt structures of oppression and implicit structures of oppression, that term was expanded to include essentially an entire social order. So not just the institutional, the police, the courts, these things that were actually acting against the interests of some people, but that the entire principles, ideas, narratives, everything to do with that society is the structure of oppression. And so it became like an awareness of that, and it morphed from the conversation of race to women's suffrage to issues of gender, disability, climate, and all it kind of bled into all of these various different conversations. And there was a kind of two-prong approach, which was through kind of social and political activism. So you had the kind of student riots of the 60s and kind of over activism against these things. But then there was also an academic side of it. So, and they, as academics, oriented themselves towards academia, particularly the field of education, specifically for the purposes of radicalizing a generation or two generations of educators to influence the education of students that would raise this awareness, this awakenness, this wokeness in the minds of an increasing number of people as time went on, so that they would resist and rebel against the current status quo, the current structure of society, and rebel and push back against it such that it increases the likelihood that the liberal, capitalistic, white supremacist, cis heteronormative patriarchal society would collapse, and the next lovely thing that would come after, which would be closer to justice than we currently are, would then come about. I know that's pretty long-winded.
Quite an intro there.
Yeah, but I think that's as a definition, the pushback has come about because, well, there was pushback in the 60s and the 70s, right, with the Soviet Union and the kind of, and I should say that this movement is, in theory, it's Marxian.
Are you saying that's where it started to rear its head the most, as in more obviously in the 60s? The 60s and 70s, you're saying that's where it started? In
the West, yes, in America, and then in sort of French, in France and on the continent. There was this adoption of a Marxian analysis. So Marx in the 1800s, which was then adopted by people like Lenin to agitate for the revolutions that happened. And then the bringing about of the Soviet Union. It was very much the driving theory, the driving worldview behind those, behind Soviet Russia, Maoist China, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and a whole bunch of others.
Ho Chi Minh.
Yes, Vietnam. So Marx was essentially arguing against, because he had this kind of this idea of history. The societies went from slave societies to feudal societies to aristocratic societies to capitalistic societies, and then what would come after would be socialism, and then socialism would be the vehicle that arrived us to communism, and that's when everything would be great. The idea of private property wouldn't exist. No one would be excluded. No one would be alienated because it wouldn't even be a thing that you could think. And then everything would be wonderful.
And that's what they saw as the end goal, was communism.
Yeah, that was the end of history. That was when everything we get there. We arrive. Perfect. Yeah, everything's like utopia. And then this didn't happen in the several instances when people tried to bring those things about, i.e. Soviet Union, Maoist China, yada yada yada. And theorists afterwards had to sit there and actually confront the fact that their expectations that places like Britain, France, Germany were prime and ready for the fall of capitalism, for socialism to come in, and then we would move forward towards justice. And their kind of criticism of Marx, that he had a kind of narrow-minded focus on economics, and that what was required instead was a cultural assessment, not just one pillar of society, which is the economics side of things, but also to criticize the religion, to criticize the education, to criticize the law, to criticize the media as these kind of foundational pillars of society. And so from the beginning of the 20th century, with the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, known as the Frankfurt School.
It's one of your favourites, isn't it, that one?
Maybe. And so then that kind of got the ball rolling into what I introduced earlier, which was this kind of broader assessment of society is structured in certain ways to favour some groups of people in opposition to others, and race, sex, gender, climate, disability, and all the rest of it. The pushback happened in the 60s and the 70s with the realization that this kind of Marxian framework was produced nothing other than abject catastrophe, death, misery, cannibalism, starvation, blah.
Okay.
Right, it was a fucking shit show.
Right, yeah.
And
everywhere it went, by the way, not just in like one or two examples. Whenever this happened.
And upon realizing that, there was this, it was not as sexy to be overtly a communist or overtly a Marxist, because it was like, basically it was like if you were like nowadays to be like, Hitler was alright, wasn't he? He had some good ideas, right? And now everyone's like, no he didn't, shut the fuck up. Right, so it kind of that happened for a little while, but they are much better at PR than the fascists. And so they rebranded themselves as social justice movements, and they stopped calling themselves communists. They call themselves radicals instead.
Sounds much better.
Yes, that's worse.
No, it does actually, because radicalism isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Sometimes radical change is required. Sometimes you do have to...
Drastic change, maybe. Not radical sounds...
Well, I would say they're synonymous, right? Like, drastic change is radical change. Like, because if you have a system that, like, isn't working and, like, just trying to fix it, like, in bit by bit by bit, doesn't actually deal with the problem, the system still, or whatever the thing is, machine or political system or whatever, then... It's all well and good trying to fix the bike. Right? So it's past a certain point, you need a new bike, right? That's a radical shift from one thing to another, and so it isn't necessarily a bad idea. So they get to hide behind that. You know, there's an appearance of reasonableness that they use as a mask and a shield, and then behind that appearance of reasonableness is they're like, we're going to ruin your culture. It's changing now. Everything's changing now. You suck. Right? You've broken the world, everything sucks, and we're going to change it. Reasonable, defensive, we're radicals, we're trying to do for social justice.
With additional payments. What?
And so they went quiet for a while, and then whilst it went quiet, although they just retreated, because at this point they weren't as much of an academic movement as they are now. There was a small subset of academia that was focused on this, because that was really the beginning of the social sciences. They didn't exist before the beginning of the 20th century, or thereabouts. And once there was this realization that it wasn't cool to be a Marxist anymore, they just retreated into the academy, where you have academic freedom and no one pays any attention anyway because everyone's out there living their lives. And then they set up all of these different fields fused their research with radical political activism, and then sought and oriented themselves towards the field of education, as I explained earlier. And again, no one noticed for a very long time that they were just like seeping their way into various different institutions, because once you've captured the field of education or radicalized the field of education, right, it only takes 15, 20 years, and you've got
those people.
You've got thousands of people that you've been influencing who are educators that you've been who then leave and then go all over the world and situate themselves in schools, and who then start bringing politics into the classroom, even though it might not explicitly be in the curriculum.
Naughty, naughty.
Right, so you have this kind of they're prepared to play the long game, basically. They're like, well, we're not going to get our overt bloody revolution that we like, so we're going to sit back, we're going to do the slog or the Roydy-Doitsky long march through the institutions. And then gradually, over the last 25, 30 years, people have been realizing, people have been noticing and saying something. But because they play this game where they have this defensible appearance, right, when someone points to it and criticizes it and say, oh, these guys are doing something fucking mental, they go, well, we're just here for social justice. We're just trying to take the conversations of race, sex, gender, the climate and feminism seriously. Like, you know, so they it's called a Mott and Bailey tactic, where they're out in the field doing their mad activism, the Bailey, and then when the marauders come and try to criticize them, they retreat to the defensible Mott, defend themselves until the enemy's defeated, and now everyone is just like, oh, this guy's a racist because you're trying to criticize the people who are paying attention to race. And then now he's been defeated, he retreats, issues an apology, and then when people stop paying attention, back out they go into doing what they were doing before. And that's been happening more and more and more and more. The one last thing, and then I'm going to stop talking.
This is the Matt Brown Show, everybody.
With the two nodding dogs.
You asked.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
But no, so an important detail is that the things that are fascism and communism define themselves as in opposition to the other one. Right? The fascists are the anti-communists and the communists are the anti-fascists. But they are in a dynamic with one another, and through that rhetoric they gain followers, right? Because the people who are like, no, I really don't want communism. I'm
with those.
They're more convinced by the rhetoric that may later become fascism, and those who are convinced by the anti-fascist doctrine or language or rhetoric are like, because they're like, oh, I really don't like the fascists, they're more sympathetic, maybe not overtly and explicitly to communism, but they'll be more amenable to communistic or that kind of language that gets used. So the people then, like, as one of them agitates more, right, in response to the other one, people kind of shift backwards and forwards towards these two completely insane doctrines. And then there's normal political discourse kind of happening, not necessarily in the middle, because it often gets framed that they're the extremes of the left and the right. I'm not sure that's true. There might just be two separate, completely insane things happening above or interacting with normal
kind of a gravitational pull.
There's like normal political discourse, and then there's these two insane culty traditions drawing on people, and so the reaction, the pushback against woke, or what is now being called the woke right, is a part of this dynamic, right? Is that because people haven't been paying attention. And because they've just been able to just bait that, like, they'll almost win. And to be frank about it, right? Once you're in the schools, once you're in the courts, right? Once you're in the government, once you're in the media, these pillars of society I was talking about earlier, it's like you know, this the 11th hour, right? It's like that you've almost got institutional control of the movement of a civilization and institutional power. Because people have been waking up to it because of the trans stuff, or because of the queer stuff, because of like BLM, right? Because of these big things that happen, and all of a sudden everyone's like, why am I a racist for saying something perfectly reasonable?
Or you're told that it's not reasonable anymore, so
Right.
And if you're not aware of it, that definitely makes you...
Yeah,
exactly.
Am I racist? Yes, you are, for thinking that, basically.
For even questioning it.
For having the thought.
And so, once people... And this has been the worry of the people who've been trying to call it out over the last 10, 15 odd years, is that, yes, this is bad, but the reaction that it potentially could incite is like the fucking... We don't want that. We really don't want the fascist type or minded people to come along and say, right, you liberals have not been paying any fucking attention to any of this, you fucked up, you don't get to have a say anymore. Right, now we're going to draw strict boundaries around groups and around traditions, and that's going to be it. Right, we're going to reinstantiate Christian morality throughout the whole country if we deviate, and so on and so on and so forth. And that's going to, like, that's the... And there's an activist principle on the part of the radicals, written by a guy called Sol Alinsky in a book called Rules for Radicals, in case that wasn't really obvious what they're up to. And one of the principles in this book is the main purpose of your action as activist is your enemy's reaction. Right, so you stoke your enemy until they react, and then you frame the reaction and you use it to push your movement.
So they're a 10-year-old narcissist.
Yeah, basically.
Gotcha.
Yeah. No. Seriously, it is like that kind of petty and childish and spiteful. But what that doesn't account for is that they're always going to be successful, and that the reaction is like, because if you're a child and you do that and it works a little bit every now and again, and you're like, oh, this works, I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah,
and then you do it, and then you do it, and someone comes along and goes, no,
we need more of that.
Well, that's
we need more people to get punched in the face.
Hey man,
and they deserve it.
Well, I would say no, because that's gonna...
No. Don't punch people.
But do you mean literal punch?
I mean both, because there's a lot of people that need knocking down. Because they
need saying no.
They're going about their lives without any recourse, and more. So, I don't necessarily always mean a literal punch, but that's where it starts. That's where... What do you call it? Behaviour, altering.
You have to stand up to it. And the thing is, we haven't been standing up to it.
No.
Like we've just been because people are generally decent and good-willed, and they don't want to get in an argument. They've got shit to do. Everyone's got lives. Everyone's got a family. Everyone's got mortgage. They're like, I don't want to fucking argue with you. I'm just gonna whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
And they just let them get away with it.
And they get away with it. And they get away with it. And they get away with it.
And they push more and more and more.
So I agree with you.
Yeah.
We need to be standing up to it. And we need to be...
And not just from this angle, I mean many angles.
Yeah.
Of people just getting away with shit. Yeah, not being called out. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
I'm agreeing with you. I think you're right. The problem is, because of their tactics, how you do that is going to be very important. Because their whole modus operandi is to try and wind you up until you do something stupid.
Yeah, punch them.
Punch them.
And they're like, that was uncalled for.
And then they're like, look, this patriarchal, cis-heteronormative fascist has just assaulted my trans daughter. Yeah, exactly.
Straight.
Yeah,
Did you say that? Sorry.
No,
this is such a long list of
I know,
things I'm so privileged. Sorry, let me get the list out.
You're born 90 years too late. I believe.
But how we push back against it's going to be very important, and because it has to be with clarity, has to be precise and targeted, so that they cannot deploy those kinds of arguments. Which is why, shameless plug, I've been on my Substack, The Critical Skeptic. I'm currently trying to lay out an argument that this practice of radical scholars who have fused political activism with research, so that they're actively trying to bring about a desired state of political affairs through the radicalization of education and the production of biased content to support policies that they want to see put into place, that this is unethical. I'm like, how is this not a question for research ethics? How is it not? We've got all these ethics committees throughout academia. If you do some research, you have to submit a methodology to an ethics committee, and they give you the thumbs up or the thumbs down if you've done enough. But you have an entire subset of academia who's, I I'm not doing any interpretive work when I say this. You go and read their work and they tell you this is what they're up to. And I'm like, well, how on earth is this not a situation where reasonable ethical mechanisms of constraint can be can articulate that this is happening and act against it? Simply just by saying no. You have an ultimatum. Stop what you're doing or get out. And yes, they're going to accuse you of censorship. They're going to accuse you of being a liberal. They're going to accuse you of tyranny and all the rest of it, and fascism. Because they're the social justice people and they're trying to stop them from doing their social justice research.
What do you mean by liberal in this context?
Liberal as in the like Western liberal societies where we do our best to maximize freedom, not liberal in the American left-wing sense, or the
liberal way it should
or
be,
neoliberal, kind of the new world order of spreading.
So you think
around,
kind of like Enlightenment.
The kind of like Western Enlightenment values where it's not
free, do what you want, but as long as it doesn't harm anyone else.
Right, and like democratic, that kind of attitude.
Generally rational as well as the key thing to that.
Yeah,
I mean all the values that were pushing the world beyond where it ever been into a new era of prosperity. Those values that we should now shit on and get rid of.
But they also at the same time, which is true. The practice of that did cause harm. I can't sit here and pretend like there weren't transgressions against human beings while the society was being grown.
I think that's also it's impossible to avoid. And I guess if you kind of analogize civilization as a person, that person has made mistakes and cocked up in their teenage years or early 20s where they're just starting to feel a bit powerful. And how the fuck are they going to learn how to deal with these conflicts and cock-ups when they happen without making the cock-up? Because no one's magically prescient.
No,
Civilizations develop. And this is why I do get wound up with the kind of change now, just stop oil like it's fucking easy in 3 seconds. Is these things have developed naturally, rationally, logically, over consensus, over a long fucking time with experience and events that feed into that. So why the hell do you think, because you've got a feeling now, that your opinion and your sense of direction for where we should go is more valid than the natural course we've taken for thousands of years? There's a through line you can see throughout all of Western history. I'm sure it's the same everywhere else, but I only know the West, so I don't want to get out of my lane there. You can see the through line, how it's evolved from fucking Greece to Rome to medieval to the British Empire, Spanish, French, and now to the Yanks. You can see the evolution. So why the fuck do you think that what you want to do now, because I don't even know what you're upset about, is more valid than that? I can't understand it. But on the topic of the more obvious backlash that we reference YouTube. Now there's a lot of facts don't care about your feelings, bro, kind of thing. I think that's directly contributed to what we're seeing in the formerly silent majority, to use a cliche, coming out now politically in, obviously, this country in America. I don't know much about all the others, to be fair. You got the rise of reform in Britain recently, which 10 years ago would have been seen as the fucking loony party.
Yeah.
Donald Trump rise, exactly the same thing. 10, 15 years ago, fucking lunatic party. And now, arguably, they're the party of the majority.
Yeah, well, it's no mistake that these people, it takes a few big names to come out and start saying things where people can get behind, because without that it just won't go anywhere. Like I say, the silent majority don't start saying anything.
They need to be emboldened by someone
to go actually this guy's not afraid to say this, like the Trumps, the Farages, they aren't afraid to say what a lot of people think. But obviously the problem is, obviously the public say it in a bad way because they just don't know how to articulate it or understand the point fully. So it takes people like Farage, who's a good speaker, who obviously I'm a fan of, to come out and articulate and say, and so everyone can go, yeah, that one, that's what we mean.
But I guess the real question is, with these kind of these counter people, is how much do we trust that they're doing their things or saying their things in good faith and they genuinely believe it, or are they just trying to implement their own kind of system of control? And the answer is probably a little bit of everything, I should imagine. But it's just because you said kind of the counterpunch normally leans more towards very, very structured, slightly fascist or fascist adjacent kind of things coming in.
Can do.
That's kind of what I see now, and I see that throughout history.
Well, that's the risk.
So what you're saying really reminds me. I'm gonna mention fucking Rome again.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Basically, when stuff was going tits, I won't go into it. There was chaos and civil war, and then Augustus rises and goes, no more of that. We're going back to family values. We're all being nice. We're all being proper. No fucking knees on show ever, and everything will be fine.
And how does he implement that idea?
How does he implement that?
Yeah.
Well, with a mixture of policy and targeted violence.
Targeted
violence.
violence.
Yeah. But the thing with him is,
right.
I imagine he'd be kind of on the lines of almost like a Jordan Peterson-y type figure, where he wasn't a fighter for the most part, he was an intellectual. So he gets it by packaging his point in a way that's more intelligent than you can package yours. Therefore he wins, and also is rich with a big ass fucking army behind him. But that is what you were saying reminded me of. And I can see the same kind of flapping butterfly wings going towards that way now. So basically, is what we're seeing a product of our time, or is it just our time's version of something that's like an eternal, raging, endless debate, constantly switching around?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would
tell me the answer now.
like we have to have this conversation to like reject it, sort of thing. If that's where it does end up going, which is what we're discussing now, what we're seeing.
Inevitably.
You hear that, Mr. Anderson? That is the sound of inevitability.
You think of it like if you have an argument with...
Like it's going down a road that you know is a dead end, but you still need to go down there to...
just to rule it out,
yeah,
kind of thing.
just to see.
But it's more like if you ever have an argument with someone who you know either you're going to be married to them forever, or you know there's no way that you don't want to not be friends anymore, so you have to find some fucking common ground. Or like Lord of the Flies, you're stuck here. Whatever, this is Lord of the Flies, we're all stuck on Earth, no one's going away for a good old while. What do? You compromise. So is the end game of this basically going, okay, we'll take a few bits of your better points, you're not having all of that shit. By the same token, yes, we do need more hard logic, we do need maybe a bit more boundaries, but no fucking hireling and jackboots, none of that.
So this is what I was referring to earlier when I said that there's reasonable political discourse and then these two mad things happening on the periphery. Because reasonable political discourse are the sort of the left-wing progressive types and the kind of more conservatively minded people where the conservatives, as the name suggests, like to conserve the things that have come from the past that have shown that they're of worth. They like to protect the boundaries that currently exist. And the progressive types look at those and they see where some people are being left out or excluded, or these boundaries could be defined better, or and so there's...
Or no longer applicable, maybe. Yeah.
Well, yeah, or no longer applicable. We need some new ones. We need to imagine some new possibilities and some new ideas. The conservatives aren't very good at that. The progressives are quite good at that, but the progressives aren't very good at maintaining boundaries. They're good at breaking them down and suggesting new ones, but they're not good at instantiating them and then maintaining them.
How's this going to work? Oh, fuck knows.
So we need this, which I think it's why our parliament is just constructed the way that it is. So you have this adversary position where you have these two voices and these two perspectives reaching a compromise with one another. They put forward, whoever's in charge in government puts forward their vision, and then it's the role of the opposition to come along and chip away at the edges, and then it swaps, and then it changes, and then someone else comes in, and I think that is healthy. It's slow, and that's the criticism that the radicals make of the current system is that we want change now. Injustice is so unacceptable to us. The suffering of these people is so unnecessary and so unacceptable. Your slow, sclerotic process doesn't get us to justice in time, so we have to do away with the whole fucking thing.
And they sure as shit can't speak for themselves, by the way.
Yeah, of course they can.
So basically, it's a natural thing that's always happened and is a net good. Seems to me. Maybe, again, it's too extreme, but that some idea of this, like you say, these two kind of extreme or polarised forces circling around like a middle is not a bad way of introducing things and moving stuff forward, because to be fair to both of these sides, they're the only ones who have ideas. Most of us in the middle are just like, this is alright, isn't it? So maybe it is a net good.
Yeah, well, I mean,
just to even suggest
if you
the idea,
I mean, if you scale out, like, yeah, I mean, maybe, but the problem with that is that I think that's a hard argument to make for people who are living through it, because they're in the muck. They're the ones who are sending their kids to school and then having them come home and they've changed their name.
I agree. That's a very, very
off.
big picture view.
And and so it's difficult for people to be like, well, in the long run, this will be good for society.
This is why we're coming to the end game of this period, because I would imagine, as always happens, they've taken it too far. One side or the other always starts to take the piss, and at that moment, so what's happening is the fist is coming in very slowly at the moment.
Yeah. Well, you just hope they stop at one. You know, like in any kind of confrontation, say between two men, right? Like it ramps up. There's some agitation, and it ramps up backwards and forwards, and then you wind up, and then maybe it is the moment. It's like, now you need to be sat on your ass because you've crossed some lines. But then there's the temptation, that little primal urge, not to stop at one punch. Yeah. The little, and then you get the adrenaline, and if you're not controlled and you're not cautious or trained in what you're doing, you're knocking down, and then you keep hitting him. And then maybe you kill the guy. And then now you're the bad guy. Doesn't matter what happened before. Doesn't matter what your justification was. Doesn't matter. Yeah. You'll say, I'm an innocent man. He did this and this. Like,
self-defense.
No one gives a shit.
So in this analogy, are you kind of Israel?
That took a turn.
Okay. And that's the end.
No, it's a fair point, right? Because that is the criticism outside of they shouldn't exist at all, and so what are you doing even responding to that kind of violence, because you should expect it because you're where you shouldn't be. Outside of that is the criticism levied at the Israeli state is that and it's the action-reaction game I was talking about earlier, which is amass and antagonize their enemy, being like, you're going to kill us now, and the whole world's going to watch you do it, you're going to lose your shit, and everyone's going to turn against you, and we'll win. And we don't care if you kill thousands and thousands of our citizens, because that's going to bring
everyone
about the
death
energy.
is a victory for us.
Which
is fucked.
When they're a bit of a death cult, so
that's handy.
Yeah, it does help. Well, and because it's like, and then I find this really interesting. I don't know if we go into this conversation too much, but because I keep hearing the rules of war being brought up around this conversation, and it's like, fair enough, right? Maybe it is good to have some rules to war, but past a certain point, they're redundant, right? Because when it gets to the point where it's an existential, if you're having some kind of boundary disagreement and you're throwing some soldiers at a boundary, and it's like, have some rules for that. Maybe don't torture civilians, let aid come through, and all the rest of it. But when it comes down to an existential conflict, which I think it is in both cases here, the all is fair in love and war. It's like, I don't care what your rules are. Someone has set themselves at war against me and are seeking my destruction.
I think that would be
for both parties, by the way.
A more valid way to think about it if there wasn't the context of a wider, more powerful international community around it. If it was just two isolated tribes, for example, who they're alone in the world, then obviously anything fucking goes, as who cares, and no one's going to know.
I think it still applies, because I think that the international community is part of the game, right? It's part of the narrative and the story that gets what people believe about what is happening in the Middle East is really important.
Yeah.
Because if whoever's playing what's the first casualty of war is truth.
Yes.
Right, and it becomes political. It's political warfare. The warfare of our age is not hot, cold. It's political. It's narrative. It's belief. It's the world that occupies people's consciousness, and what they're then prepared to do in action in response to what they believe to be true.
You think that's air you're breathing now?
And then it's interesting because how generally when you want to come to the end of a conflict, 9 times out of 10 or even more, your goal is not to annihilate the other side. It's basically to have the best terms so that you can negotiate from a position of strength. That's basically the point of that. So if everything, as you say, I believe correctly, is this kind of psychological hearts and minds, political theatre, whatever you fucking want to call it, how the hell do you decide who's won? Therefore, how is it ever going to get resolved? Because let's say you look at the end of the World Wars, there was no way the Germans and the Japanese were ever going to be like, right, we want this, go fuck off, you just lost. But in this one, is it 3-1 to Israel? Palestine winning 4-3? I don't know. No one can fucking tell. So how are they ever going to come to
it's not as quantifiable. Yeah.
Well, that's the scary part. There's I don't know. I'm not super clued in on this a little bit, but I don't know how many attempts there has been at trying to arrive at some kind of amicable solution.
Well, we certainly don't know how serious those attempts have been.
And good faith that the participants were in when it was happening, and exactly trying to show us a story to the wider world to gain support, because look, we've tried to solve it.
Like the American peace talks for Ukraine. It's like, give us your oil to everyone all the time.
Too many games basically being played at the same time. Game of politics and money and all that.
Yeah.
Why don't you answer in the comments who's winning the wars and by which scores? there's two major ones I know of at the moment. I reckon Ukraine versus Russia is kind of 3-3 in extra time. Fuck knows what's happening in Gaza.
I don't know, man. It's sad. It makes me sad.
I think that's probably the correct response, actually.
But I mean, let's take it back to the original question, because I think this kind of dynamic, this kind of approach, is also at play in the culture wars.
Absolutely.
Right. It is. Like I was saying, it's like you've got the people. So there's a philosopher of science called Thomas Kuhn, and he.
When was this guy about?
1960s.
Okay, so
1960s.
Recent boy.
Yeah, fairly recent. And he wrote a book called Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he's like describing what happens when one scientific paradigm, you go from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics and then quantum or whatever it is. So these kind of massive jumps in how we understand the world that we live in.
And complexity.
Yes, and he draws, to describe this, he draws an analogy and uses politics. And the way he describes it, and so like you can think both science and politics in these terms, is that you have the current way of doing things, right? And that current way of doing things provides you with stuff to do. It provides you with answers to certain questions about what's happening in the world with science, or your purpose with politics. But then, and it gives you productive stuff to do at the same time. But then there's a number of things and questions that it can't answer, and some problems that it can't solve. And maybe that's fine. It's a good trade-off. Nothing's perfect. You have to have a way of doing something. There's some things it can't solve. We'll come to those later on down the line. Maybe we'll solve them. Maybe we won't. But if those anomalies, those problems stack up, right? The number of people who become disenfranchised with the current way of doing things increases. And then as that gets bigger and bigger, they then start communicating with one another and looking for an alternative, looking for what's next. And then one arises, or one gets put forward, which then draws the number of people who are disenfranchised with the current system towards this new system. And then that the popularity of that one grows, and then the people who like this one are defending it, the people who like the new one are defending it. Now, he had this concept, this idea of incommensurability, which is the concepts and the ideas of these two paradigms, there's no overlap, or there's minimal overlap, right? And so once you get to that point, he says, there is no political discourse, because neither party can agree on the terms to resolve the conflict.
They're so far apart that there's no
because this party's standard of saying, well, look, we won. They go, well, no, you don't, because we don't accept the terms of your proof. And when they go, well, here's why we are right. That was hard to say. This one goes, well, no, I don't accept the terms of your proof. And so you have this incommensurable backwards and forwards. And he says at the end of this analogy that the only way of moving forward is through coercion or force. That's it. So I don't know. Is it like that could be where we are, right? In the culture wars and in these other incontractable wars. It could just come down to either they capture the institutions and win, and that's how society's going to be now, or, you know, I hope he has failed to capture something in his analogy, and his description of scientific paradigms and political paradigms. I hope there is
a third option.
some other third option whereby we can, and I think if I could try and put one forward, it is something like the articulation of this dynamic, right? Rather than like not some third thing, because then it just becomes another paradigm in the conflict, right? But some kind of stepping back and recognizing that this is the dynamic at play, and realizing that your pull towards one thing or another, and you're like in the context of the kind of Hamas protesters or the Israeli defenders, the kind of visceral gut feeling they have against the other one, to recognize that feeling is, while legitimate, part of a dynamic that, if it continues like this, is not going to lead anywhere nice, and to just calm it. And I know that sounds really simple, but like it's like I think this is why not, like in the Western tradition, or the British English tradition perhaps, you know, we value these ideas of being able to agree to disagree with one another, right? Like hey, look, I can't see where you're coming from, and you can't see where I'm coming from, but one of us is going to kill the other, and one of our mothers is going to lose a child. So let's just fucking agree to disagree. I'll leave you alone.
That was in fact the whole reason
You leave me
English
alone.
common law was invented, to stop a thing called blood feud, whereby you'd have things for generations and generations. Well, my great-great-great-granddad got killed by your great-granddad, then his son killed his son, so now I've got to kill you.
Yeah.
Like, fucking dumb.
I
So
agree.
basically what we're saying
Fucking
the world
dumb.
is English common law.
Hey, I mean, well, no, that's the conservative argument for something that has withstand the acid test of time, right? It's imperfect, but it's adaptive. It's malleable. It can adjust and move itself through history, and has done for 1,000 years.
Well,
1,000 years.
Maybe quite a nice way to end this if we make a new definition of what we consider to be woke. So it's basically aware or enlightened. So as you were saying, if the way out of this is everyone realising that they're just part of a dynamic, maybe the real wokeness is being woke to that dynamic.
Bum, bum.